I'm very excited to say that I'm joined by Meryam Omi, who is COP26 High-Level Champions Finance Department and also Head of Sustainability and Responsible Investment Strategy at Legal and General Investment Management. Hello, it's good to have you here.
Hello. Thanks, Lizzie.
A big day being Finance Day at
Yes,
COP26.
absolutely.
We have actually just seen today that the Marrakesh Partnership event has launched the Net Zero Financing Roadmap. And for those who are watching who may not know what that is and what that involves, can you tell us more about its importance?
Yeah, sure. So what we know is that net zero commitments are here, and the financial institutions are saying we definitely want to be on the road to limiting the temperature to 1.5 degrees. That's aligned to net zero by 2050. That's great. But we also know that it needs to be financed. And it's not really that helpful to keep kind of saying 1 trillion to 4 trillion, all those numbers. It doesn't really mean anything, right? So what we wanted to do is to really break down this number into where, in terms of regions, where, in terms of sectors, and then by whom. Who's going to actually pay for it? So the high level number is $175 trillion by 2050 to be aligned to net zero. So that's a huge number.
Yeah.
What that means that immediately we have to triple investment into those low carbon investments to get by 2025. So like it's an immediate action that we have to have. Now here's the good news. Because of all the commitments that we're making, the wall of money is there. What we have to really figure out, as I said, is to just figure out where it's going to happen. There's a little bit of sequencing that needs to happen depending on the market maturity and the technologies and so forth. So if I just sort of break it down a little bit further, in terms of sectors, we obviously have to decarbonize the electricity sector. We have to decarbonize the way we drive transport. And those technologies are slightly different from different technologies. So this website that actually is actually on the GFAN's website.
Okay.
I should probably know what the URL is. Just go to GFANS and it's got net zero financing roadmaps, and you can actually break down the numbers by those sectors and see how much is exactly needed.
On that, could you kind of highlight, I guess, the main sectors that will be responsible for that?
Yeah, so actually about half of those investments will be from the electricity sector.
Okay.
Now, here's the good news. A lot of electricity can be provided through renewable means, and the likes of renewable energies like solar and wind are cost competitive. So we don't actually have to invest in fossil fuel-based systems anymore. But that also means that we just need a lot more of it. Yeah. We also need a lot of technologies into the infrastructure to provide electric vehicles and so forth. Another sector that's going to be quite a struggle is agriculture and land and food. We haven't really thought about sort of the way we eat in the context of finance, but we have to. But that's about 25% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And that means that we have to invest about $150 billion every year immediately from now on. So that's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. Yeah. That big figure, $175 trillion, is huge.
125, yeah.
125, sorry. It sounds like an obvious question, but how are we going to get there in the stages in transitioning to that amount?
Yes. So the good news again, I'm just going to focus on the good news.
Positivity.
Positivity.
It's a lot of money.
Is that, as I said, a lot of investments are ready to be deployed in terms of capital. And that's because they are NPV positive. It actually makes financial sense to be invested in the likes of solar, the likes of electric vehicles and so forth. And we expect a lot of those investments to come from the corporate balance sheet. So a lot of corporations who might be financing those utility plants globally, or actually investing into electric vehicles and so forth, or green hydrogen and so forth, they're starting to actually deploy that through their capital, through the balance sheet. And then the institutional investors are backing this through their investments into equity and debt and so forth. But there are also roles to play for governments here, right? And they need to really come in and provide the right investable environment in terms of making sure that some of the de-risking mechanisms are in place. And if that mechanism is there, you can expect to see a lot of private finance coming in, because all those commitments are saying that they want to align their investments. They're looking for those investments everywhere. And so there's really a role to play for all private finance actors as well as the governments.
So let's talk a little bit more about that. What is the relationship between public and private finance?
So this 125 trillion that's needed, we expect about 70% of that to come from private finance. Okay, so a good majority.
Yeah.
The rest of that would have to come from government or government sort of related entities financing. But there's a fair amount that's to do with sort of partnership, having some kind of partnership between private and public to be able to invest in it jointly. And so that there is a role for de-risking mechanism using development agencies, multilateral banks and so forth, as well as blended finance, which is to make sure that some of the de-risking mechanism is in place to crowd in the private finance. So we've been talking about this for a long time as a sort of a silver bullet, but now we really have to sort this out. So we can't just keep saying to the governments, we can't invest because the environment isn't there. Similarly, governments can't keep looking at the private finance and go, come on, invest.
Yeah.
You've got to create the right environment. Yeah.
You talked earlier about some of the sectors that we need to focus on. What sector, is it agriculture or energy, electricity, that needs decarbonising the most? Is there one in particular, or is it kind of a broad range approach?
It is a broad range, but from the amount of investments, it's electricity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's about half of that is going to come from electricity. But let's not forget that when we're talking about electric vehicles, that's also from electricity,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And if you're talking about kind of green hydrogen for shipping, for steel and so forth, that's also from electricity. So they are not really one sector. Electricity just runs through.
Right.
It's all about making sure that we're electrifying the system. The other thing that's really exciting is particularly in areas of, let's say, emerging markets where perhaps the energy system isn't quite in place. We can think about decentralized energy system in a way that we never could in developed markets, because they might not necessarily have all the grids and so forth. So this research also highlights that huge amount of money needs to be deployed in emerging market. But the good news is technology is mature now. So it's not like a brand new technology. It's something that's actually been worked out in other markets. And so they need to be deployed in Africa at large scale, in Asia in huge amount of scale, as well as Central America and South America and so forth. Yeah.
And on that point, how does it look? How is that building for these emerging markets in the near and distant future?
So it's starting to happen in a lot of the markets. I mean, obviously renewables is not new to anybody, right? And so in terms of scale, I think about half of the money that needs to be deployed overall is going to have to be in Asia.
Okay.
And you have different dynamics playing out in terms of China, India, Southeast Asia, and obviously there's Japan, which is not an emerging market, but it's a very large market. And you see that in a lot of those markets, they are seeing that coal is actually not as cheap as they thought it was. Gas is also starting to be very, very expensive, especially if you're sort of building LNG plants and so forth. And so the dynamics are starting to change in the most important market, which is Asia, where we really need to make sure that decarbonization progress is going forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
How would you urge private finance actors to exercise pressure on parties?
On the governments, yeah. So there's been a lot of advocacy and dialogue with governments, and some of that is to make sure that the regulatory environment is there for the private capital to flow, and some of that is to do with the right kind of taxations and subsidies. So we've been talking about carbon tax for a long time. We've got to make sure that the incentive for those kind of investments are in place, and disincentive for the fossil fuel-based industry, which is really not that sustainable. So that's the kind of thing that the private finance has been asking governments to do, and I think we're going to continue to do that. But I think the governments want to hear from private finance because they need their money, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we've got to a point where at least we're on the same page about net zero. It's just figuring out the semantics now.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of a lighthouse investment opportunity with the potential to be truly transformative for the sector and region?
Yeah, sure. So we've highlighted in the research 17 lighthouse examples. So they look at the different investment cases depending on the maturity of the technology. So depending on, for example, there might be earlier technologies like green hydrogen, or they might be pretty mature, as I said, like solar and wind. But we see some cases like solar in Africa, as I said, being an incredibly, kind of ripe market to be deployed en masse and at scale. We also see green steel in Asia being one of the markets that could really flourish going forward, and then EV in Europe and in America in particular, where infrastructure is starting to be built, people actually starting to choose a lot of electric vehicles, so it can really take off.
Yeah. And I guess the question that's more relevant to today is Finance Day at COP26.
Yeah.
What has been most exciting for you being here, especially with this new plan and roadmap put in place? Are you positive about moving forward and the changes that are happening?
I am positive. I think, there's been quite a lot of work to be on the same page about net zero. A lot of people are sort of claiming to be net zero, but we didn't know what it means. And I feel like we're literally on the race. We call it race to zero. We're literally on the same race, kind of following the same rules and say, let's get to the same goal. Now, there might be a race element, competition with each other, and that's great. We need that competition between private sectors. But at the same time, we need to kind of get there. And from my perspective, working in a financial industry, so many people I work with said to me, I want to be part of the solution. I want to work for a company who's going in the right direction. So I think that momentum is there. We just need to make sure we kind of get to the same goal together.
Yeah, absolutely. For those who are watching and want to learn more about those roadmaps, can you remind us where to actually go again?
It's the website that I don't remember, isn't it? It's on the GFAN's website, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. If you Google Net Zero financing roadmaps, thank you for testing me for something that I should have looked up.
I'm sorry to test
That's
you.
all right.
If you were to look up exactly that, then hopefully also we may be able to share something on the COP TV socials to help people along.
And it's very interactive, and you can find out all the different ways in where you can slice and dice the numbers.
Yeah. So okay. Last question is it's just about the importance of having a finance day at COP26. What's your kind of stand on that, and why is today so important?
Finance is the most important thing, right? Like, we can have all the commitments, but if the money isn't there, we just cannot get to net zero. So we don't see finance as something that we talk about on a day like this. It's about something that we have to talk about every day, whether we're talking about resilience and adaptation, whether we're talking about ocean, whether we're talking about transport. Every day we try to incorporate the element of finance, figure out where the money should come from, who should step up, whether it be governments or private sector. So I hope that we're going to continue this conversation. Money is there. Yeah. We just need to make sure it's financing the right things.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. And so actually your work will be present throughout the rest of COP26 as well.
Yes, I'll try to.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll see more of you around. So thank you, Meryam, for that.